Welcome to Lesson 7 in our study in the book of Daniel as a part of the prophecy series. Today we're going to get into chapter 6 of Daniel, which is really the last chapter that deals with historical narratives concerning Daniel's life. I want to remind you that, especially when we look at chapter 6, Daniel's purpose, or the writer's purpose of Daniel in giving us this story, is not to give us every detail about his life, but just to focus on a major detail that we'll need to know. Now, later on, when we get into the prophetic passages, starting with chapter 7, it's going to help us to set the context of what we see as far as the prophetic material that we're going to be going through in this study in the book of Daniel. So today we're going to look at Daniel's faithfulness from Daniel chapter 6, verses 1 through 28. Now, when we begin this study, we want to take a look at the very first part of the study, which is going to give us a little bit of where he is and what's happening. And that's what we're going to see in Daniel chapter 6, verses 1 to 3, where we see Daniel's prominence. Now, if you remember, when we ended in chapter 5, we basically saw the Babylonian kingdom defeated by the Medo-Persian Empire. Belshazzar is killed, and basically the Babylonian Empire comes to an end, and we're not sure what's going to happen with Daniel. Well, Daniel chapter 6 kind of gives us an idea of what's happening. So let's take a look at this portion of Scripture together. So here's what the text says. It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps to be throughout the whole kingdom, and over them 3 high officials, of whom Daniel was one, to whom these satraps should give account, so that the king might suffer no loss. Then this Daniel became distinguished above all other high officials and satraps, because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. Wow. So obviously a lot has changed since the fall of Babylon. Daniel emerges to be in a significant role, and that's the setting here. We don't know all of the details of how it happened. We're just supposed to focus on what we're being shown here in chapter 6. So let's talk about this. So the first thing I want you to notice is, as we talk about the Medo-Persian Empire, you need to understand how big it was. So I've included a picture for you of the Medo-Persian Empire at around 500 BC. And this would kind of tell you the extent of the empire during Daniel's lifetime. So it extended from what really is modern-day Libya to us, all the way through Egypt, then going up through the land of Israel and the areas around that, up over through what we would call modern-day Turkey into modern-day Greece, and then extending all the way to the east, all the way over beyond Iran into Afghanistan and India. So this is a significant kingdom that you and I need to be aware of. So let's take a look at what the text is saying. So Darius's structure of government is shown to us in Daniel chapter 6, verses 1 to 2. So as we begin, we are opening up with basically telling us how the king of the Medo-Persian Empire runs his government. So Darius made a government structure with Daniel as one of 3 top officials. So remember, the text tells us there were 120 satraps. So maybe these were some sort of administrators. Maybe they were over 120 different areas. But these folks were in charge of those, and then over them were 3 people that they had to answer to. And one of those 3 is Daniel. And so we're going to see Daniel's achievement in Daniel chapter 6, verse 3. And what we're going to see is basically talking about who Daniel is and his character and how that profits him in the work that he does. So what we're going to notice is the text tells us that Daniel excelled above the other officials. Now, from what we know of Daniel so far, from Daniel chapter 1 through Daniel chapter 5, we would expect this to be true of Daniel. Even though Daniel is later in age at this point, he's getting towards the end of his life, he continues to reflect the type of character that puts him above others around him. So this results in the king having some thoughts about what to do with Daniel. So the text tells us the king thought about making Daniel the chief official in the empire. So remember, we saw in the picture how big the empire is. And so he's talking about raising Daniel up because of his excellent character, because of the excellent spirit in him, to a place where he basically is running the show for the king. That's quite a promotion. Now, as you would expect, not everybody's going to be happy with that. We kind of saw that, remember, in Daniel chapter 3, where we saw the problem that occurred with Daniel's friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and the jealousy and the plotting of those who wanted to get rid of them. Well, we see the same thing happening here in the Medo-Persian Empire. And that's what the text is going to tell us. So we're going to see the plot against Daniel in Daniel chapter 6, verses 4 through 9. So I want you to notice with me what the text says. Verse 4. Then the high officials and the satraps sought to find a ground for complaint against Daniel with regard to the kingdom. But they could find no ground for complaint or any fault because he was faithful, and no error or fault was found in him. Then these men said, "We shall not find any ground for complaint against this Daniel unless we find it in connection with the law of his God." Then these high officials and satraps came by agreement to the king and said to him, "O King Darius, live forever." All the high officials of the kingdom, the prefects and the satraps, the counselors and the governors, are agreed that the king should establish an ordinance and enforce an injunction that whoever makes petition to any god or man for 30 days, except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions. Now, O king, establish the injunction and sign the document so that it cannot be changed according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be revoked. Therefore, King Darius signed the document and injunction. Wow, so quite an interesting portion of Scripture, this plot, their conniving, their deception of the king. Let's take a look at what the text is telling us. So when we come to Daniel chapter 6, verse 4, we see that they're seeking to discredit Daniel. The text tells us the other officials sought to find a means to discredit Daniel. So obviously these must have been some folks who maybe their ambitions were thwarted because Daniel was in this role. They just wanted to get him out of there. Maybe they had some attitudes because he was a Jew. I'm not sure. The text doesn't tell us that. All it tells us is that they're trying to get rid of him. So they're trying to find a way to discredit Daniel before the king. But here's the problem. When you talk about Daniel, we already know from our own examination of the biblical text concerning who he is, that's going to be a hard task. So the text tells us they were frustrated by Daniel's faithful character. So there really wasn't anything that he was doing that they could point to in his position, in his service to the king and the kingdom. They couldn't find anything. So here's what they decided to do. We're going to see in Daniel chapter 6, verses 5 through 9, the conspiracy. So they figured out a way to find something on Daniel. So let's take a look at what's being shared here in the text. First of all, they make a decision. In Daniel chapter 6, verse 5, here's what we see. The officials sought to discredit Daniel with his faith in his God. So they're coming up with a way to discredit him, not because of his service, because they can't find anything there. They figured out that the way to discredit him is because of his religious activities, because of his faith in his God, the God of the Israels. So here's what we're going to see. They go to the king, and here's what they do. There is in Daniel chapter 6, verse 6 through 9, the request for a decree, or as the text says, an injunction. So notice what's going on here. So the officials sought a decree to outlaw for 30 days prayer to anyone but the king. Now, that's a little bit hard for you and I to wrap our brains around, but for them, you have to remember they are living in a culture of the time where they viewed their rulers as semi-divine. It is not uncommon in this ancient world to view your king, even though you know he's a human being, but to ascribe to him some sort of deity. So they go and they make up this idea that, well, you know what, king, you're a great God. Nobody should be talking to any other God but you. And so they thought to make a decree for 30 days to make sure that nobody prays to anyone else but you, O king. Now, to make sure that you understand that this is a serious thing, this text tells us the decree would be solidified in the law of the Medes and Persians. So basically, if this decision is made by the king, it would be basically irrevocable because it would be placed in the law of the Medes and Persians. And once it's there, it cannot be changed. So it would be set. That's the way it is. Now, of course, that's going to bring about a crisis. And that's what we're going to see now in Daniel chapter 6, verses 10 through 11, where we see Daniel's prayer. And so let's take a look. Here's what the text tells us in verse 10. When Daniel knew that the document had been signed, he went to his house where he had windows in his upper chamber open toward Jerusalem. He got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God as he had done previously. Then these men came by agreement and found Daniel making petition and plea before his God. All right, so let's take a look at what's going on here. First of all, we're going to notice in Daniel chapter 6, verse 10, Daniel's commitment. And let's be honest, did we expect anything else? We already saw the commitment of Daniel and his friends to follow the Lord in chapter 1. We also saw that illustrated in the commitment of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and their refusal to worship the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Did we expect anything less from Daniel? So when he heard that the decree had been signed, it didn't change him. So in spite of the decree, Daniel continued his practice of prayer as usual. So he just kept on praying like he normally did, 3 times a day. Went to his upper room, opened his windows, bowed down on his knees towards Jerusalem, where, quote, the temple was, or what was left of it, and prayed to the God of heaven, to his God. Now, when we come to Daniel chapter 6, verse 11, we find out that Daniel is discovered. Well, of course he would be. They knew where he was. So here's what the text says. The officials gathered and discovered Daniel praying. They were waiting for him. They knew that he would be faithful. And all they needed to do was wait for the windows to open and Daniel to be praying, and they would come and find him praying. They caught him in the act. So now that brings us to Daniel chapter 6, verses 12 through 18, where we see the judgment against Daniel. Of course, this is what they're wanting. This is why they had the decree made. They want to bring an accusation against him. They caught him red-handed, defying the king. So they're going to bring him before the king. So let's notice what the text says, starting with verse 12. Then they came near and said before the king, concerning the injunction, O king, did you not sign an injunction that everyone who makes petition to any god or man within 30 days, except to you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions? The king answered and said, the thing stands fast according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be revoked. Then they answered and said before the king, Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or the injunction that you have signed, but makes his petition 3 times a day. Then the king, when he heard these words, was much distressed, and set his mind to deliver Daniel. And he labored till the sun went down to rescue him. Then these men came by agreement to the king and said to the king, know, O king, that it is a law of the Medes and Persians that no injunction or ordinance that the king establishes can be changed. Then the king commanded, and Daniel was brought, cast into the den of lions. The king declared to Daniel, may your God, whom you serve continually, deliver you. And a stone was brought and laid on the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring, and with the signet of his lords, that nothing might be changed concerning Daniel. Then the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting. No diversions were brought to him, and sleep fled from him. Well, we see some interesting things happening in this passage. So let's take a look at what the text is trying to tell us here. So first of all, when we go to Daniel chapter 6, verses 12 through 13, we see the accusation. And of course, there would be an accusation because this is what the plotters are wanting. So the officials accused Daniel of violating the decree before the king. So notice how they do it. They go and they say to the king, "Oh, king, do you remember that decree you made about nobody praying to anyone else but you for 30 days? And of course the king says, yes, it's in the law of the Medes and Persians. It's set. It's firm. Nobody should be challenging that. Well, we've got something to tell you, king. So they accuse Daniel and say to him, well, he's been praying 3 times a day. He doesn't care for what you're saying. Now notice the reaction of the king. And the determination of the king now is what we're going to see in Daniel chapter 6, verse 14, the king's determination. So the text tells us that the king determined to seek a means to free Daniel. Here's what's going on. It's like the king realizes, oh, I've been duped. I've been manipulated as a means to get rid of Daniel. Now, somehow I've got to figure out how to get him out of this. He understands the politics of the situation. and what has happened. And he has unwittingly become involved in a conspiracy to get rid of Daniel. Now, of course, he's trying to do everything he can to get rid of Daniel. And so he spent the whole day trying to figure it out. Well, of course, the plotters, these people who are against Daniel, aren't going to let that go by. So when we come to Daniel chapter 6, verse 15, we see the plotters' insistence. They're going to insist that this take place. So notice now, the plotters insisted that the law be carried out against Daniel. In fact, the way they kind of pointed it out to him, it's kind of like saying, listen, king, it's in the law of the Mede and Persians. Nobody has ever changed that. They kind of made it a constitutional crisis, so to speak. That what you're planning on doing, no one has ever done. Once it's established, and you yourself have said it is established in the law of the Mede and the Persians, it can't be changed. So you don't have any choice here. And if you do choose otherwise, that's going to create a bigger problem, which will reflect upon you. So they're insisting that the law be carried out. And so basically, the king really has no choice. So what we see in Daniel chapter 6, verse 16, is the judgment pronounced. So what you're going to find is the king has to do it. So the king commanded that Daniel be cast into the lion's den. Now, it's interesting, isn't it? So with the Medo-Persians, their form of execution here seems to be the issue of the lion's den. When we talked about Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 3, it was the fiery furnace. Two different cultures, two different empires, but what we see here is Daniel is commanded to be thrown into the lion's den. Now, of course, they throw him in, and before he's thrown in, the king expressed that he wanted Daniel's God to deliver him. Now, I just want to remind you of something. Our tendency is to read these stories and to ascribe to these pagan kings that they believe in God and they are somehow followers of Yahweh. They are not. They're polytheists. And if you look at the way that he refers to Daniel's God, in fact, that's what he says, your God. He didn't say my God, your God. He wants Daniel's God to rescue him. So the king is expressing, Daniel, I want your God to rescue you. So that brings us then to verse 17 of chapter 6, where we see the lion's den. And what the text tells us now is that Daniel was thrown into the lion's den and it was sealed. And what we mean by that is a stone was placed over the opening and then seals would be applied. That is, wax places where a signet ring would be put. And if those seals are broken, then you could move the stone and let them out. But by sealing it with the king's ring and with the rings of the other officials, they're ensuring that he's in there, he's not getting out. So he's thrown into the lion's den and it was sealed. Well, that gets to the whole point of getting through the night. And so the text focuses on the king that night. So when we get to chapter 6, verse 18, we see the king's anxious sleep. So the king fasted and was not able to sleep because of his concern for Daniel. So basically the text tells you the king refused food, he didn't eat. He refused distraction, whatever that means. You can fill in the blank, whatever that might mean. And he didn't sleep well that night because he's concerned, he's worried about Daniel and what has happened to him. Well, that brings us then to chapter 6, verse 19 through 24, the preservation of Daniel. So let's take a look at what the scripture text is telling us here, starting with verse 19. Then, at break of day, the king arose and went in haste to the den of lions. As he came near the den where Daniel was, he cried out in a tone of anguish. The king declared to Daniel, O Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions?" Then Daniel said to the king, "O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me, because I was found blameless before him, and also before you, O king. I have done no harm." Then the king was exceedingly glad and commanded that Daniel be taken up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no kind of harm was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. And the king commanded, and those men who had maliciously accused Daniel were brought and cast into the den of lions, they, their children, and their wives. And before they reached the bottom of the den, the lions overpowered them and broke all their bones into pieces. All right, so let's take a look here. Some amazing turn of events. This is what is so miraculous about this story. You see a king who's anxious, who runs. We see what happens with Daniel as he's brought out. We see what happens to the accusers. So let's take a look. Let's first of all notice in Daniel chapter 6, verses 19 through 20, the king's haste. So in the early morning, the king rushed to the lion's den and called out to Daniel. So obviously he's been waiting till the first sign of dawn, whatever that might be, and he gets up, gets there, cries out to Daniel, "Daniel, are you alive? Has your God protected you?" Well, when we come to Daniel chapter 6, verse 21 to 22, amazingly, you get a reply. You see Daniel's reply. Now, Daniel replied that God had protected him because of his innocence. In fact, Daniel makes it very clear that his God sent an angel to deal with the lions, to keep them from eating him, from killing him. And it's because of his innocence, and he made it very clear, "I haven't done anything wrong to you, king. That's why God has protected me." Well, notice now when we get to Daniel chapter 6, verse 23, we're going to see Daniel's release. We're going to see him released, being ordered to be released from the lion's den. So the king called for Daniel to be released. Would only make sense. He made it through the night. The lions didn't attack him. God is protecting him. The king doesn't want him there in the first place. So basically, he orders that Daniel be lifted up out of the den. And no injury occurred to Daniel in the lion's den. That very much is very similar to the things that we saw in Daniel chapter C when they brought Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego out of the fiery furnace. There was no evidence that they had been affected by the fire in any way. Well, here you have Daniel being lifted up out of the lion's den, and there's not a scratch on him. There's no evidence at all that he had been in the lion's den and had been infected in any way. So then that brings us to chapter 6, verse 24. What happens with the people who wanted to get rid of Daniel? So we see the plotter's execution. So the king ordered Daniel's accusers thrown in the lion's den. So whoever these guys were who were trying to get rid of Daniel, it's all come back on them now. And now they are ordered thrown into the lion's den. But here's the justice that we see in the Medo-Persian Empire. It isn't just these fellows who were thrown in. The text tells us their children, who would be their heirs, and their wives. Basically, all of them would be thrown into the lion's den as a form of execution. And before they even reached the bottom, it says that they were overcome by the lions and broken into pieces. Now, that brings us to the final section of Daniel. which is Daniel chapter 6, verse 25 to 28, the king's pronouncement. So basically what we see here is the pronouncement of the king concerning the events that have happened and concerning what God has done. So let's notice what the text says, starting with verse 25. Then King Darius wrote to all the peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied to you. I make a decree that in all my royal dominion, people are to tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed, and his dominion shall be to the end. He delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. He who has saved Daniel from the power of the lions. So this Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. All right, so let's take a look at this final section here. So we're going to see that when we look at the king's pronouncement, Daniel chapter 6, verse 25 tells us the recipients. So there's this pronouncement that's sent out, and here's what the text tells us. The writer records a royal proclamation which was sent throughout his kingdom. So again, I want you to notice the map of the Medo-Persian Empire during this time, around 500 BC, during the time of Daniel, the extent of it, all the way from what is today modern-day Libya, all the way over to the stretching out towards India, and all the way up to what is today modern-day Greece. That was the extent of the kingdom. So this proclamation would have gone throughout his kingdom. So here is the declaration that we see in Daniel chapter 6, verse 26 to 28. The king declared that all should fear the God of Daniel. So he's basically proclaiming the superiority of Daniel's God and that they should fear him. The God of Daniel, the king says, is sovereign and a deliverer. So basically he's talking about the power of God and the fact that God can deliver, as he delivered Daniel from the lion's den. And then the text basically ends with saying that Daniel prospered through the reign of this king and through the reign of Cyrus the Persian. That is the way the historical narrative ends. Now, next week when we come back with our next lesson, we're going to start into the prophetic material when we get into Daniel chapter 7. And so all of these historical texts give us an understanding of who Daniel is and what he has endured, and of the kingdoms that he's dealing with and who are the kings. And it's going to help lay a foundation as we begin to look at the prophetic material next week.